So, about to start working on the C4, making use of this warm weather. As you can see, it's running right now. Just had to move it so we can get the wheels off easily and have plenty of space to work. Plan right now, well, start taking the wheels off and taking the old suspension out. We got our coilovers in, so we're gonna get the old suspension out today, hopefully. That's the plan. And we'll be doing testing on the coilovers we got and getting them installed here in the next kind of over the next couple weekends. So plan on doing probably a couple part videos or separating it up, trying to do as much detailed documentation as I can for anyone else interested in doing this. But gotta say, it feels pretty good to even drive this thing a little bit, even if it is just out into the driveway to move it. But I'll get the garage warmed up here since it's still like 30 degrees only, but it's warmer than -20, which is what it has been. So get the garage warmed up and start tearing down. Probably going to start in the front because that appears to be the tougher of the two, so I think I'd rather start with the tougher of the two in the beginning and work my way towards the back, but hopefully document for you guys and give you a little clarity on what it takes to do a coilover swap on a C4 Corvette. So I guess let's get to it. Alright, so we've got the garage heated up to about 70 degrees. So like I said, what we're going to start with doing is we're going to, or I guess what we are doing, or what I am doing, is putting coilovers on the car. So we're going to have to take apart the front suspension a bit and the rear suspension a bit. We'll start on that, and what we're replacing it with is these fairly lightweight but absolutely beautiful Viking Crusader double adjustable shocks. For those wondering why I only went with double adjustable instead of triple adjustable, because that is also an option. Some of the classes I want to compete in across a couple different organizations limit you to only double adjustable, so that's what I went with. There's also the a little bit of fear with having too much adjustability, since you know, this is more of a hobby kind of thing, but can always learn and grow, and that's kind of the plan, is to start with these. So first thing we'll have to do before we can even tear into anything is jack up the car. And that isn't as simple as it sounds, and I'll show you why right now. Alright, so I'm going to show you guys the jack points on the C4. And the reason I said it's not as simple as it sounds is largely to do with the fact that the C4 really doesn't have any jacking points, or nothing really clearly stated. In the factory service manual, in fact, it only shows the cross member for the engine being an actual jacking point. There's nothing in the rear. Now, obviously, the car's been around for a while. People have figured things out, and the best place to jack these cars up, and you will actually see, so this kind of gives you an idea. There's a little jacking location that can be found on the underside, and if you take a look, try not to cover up the camera too much. See if we can get a good look. I can't give you a great idea. You can kind of see right there, there's a pinch weld. And what you really, pinch weld, I guess is what you call it. Essentially where you got a couple different pieces of the body coming together. And you really don't want to jack it up back where it says that jacking point. Where you really want to jack it up is kind of on this diagonal piece. What you'll want to do, and this is for the front, what you want to do is you'll want to get a small piece of plywood to kind of go over the foot of the jack, just to help absorb a little bit. It helps that pinch weld essentially cut into the weld, and it keeps it from bending a little bit, is what I've notice with the wood. So that's where you're going to jack it up on the front. And on the rear, you've got essentially 3 pinch welds coming together, and that's where you're going to jack up. And again, probably more important to use a piece of wood here, because what you see there is actually, I believe those are fuel lines, and the other side is brake lines, if I'm remembering correctly. Yeah, because actually there's the brake line right there, right here. So that's the fuel line right there. So you want to use a piece of plywood, because that'll just help prevent you accidentally jacking up on that and damaging the fuel line. So you've got a similar kind of setup on the driver's side. We're looking at the passenger side right now. You got a similar kind of pinch weld configuration on the driver's side, and you're just going to want to use plywood on there. So right now what we'll do is we'll get the car jacked up, take the wheels off, and then I'll start kind of going over what we're going to do with the front suspension and go from there. All right, so a lot to go over. We got the car, you can see, wheels off. This is a tricky car to jack up. And you'll kind of see here, really all these two are doing, all these two front jack stands there are doing is to make sure if the back ones fail for some reason, the car doesn't completely fall down. You realistically probably do not need to have the car this high, but I also have headers coming, and so I kind of wanted it to be up in the air once instead of dealing with it twice, which was a good thought, largely because this was kind of a pain in the ass to jack up. So I explained the jacking point in the rear there. Let me grab my flashlight. And part of the problem with that, of course, classic. Anyways, part of the problem with that is that when you're jacking it up there, you have essentially no place or no good place to really put a jack stand. Now you probably could put it where I have those front ones here, and the car will probably be okay because you're not actually jacking it up, you're just setting it there. You obviously want to be very careful because, as you can see, there's brake lines right there. But I would rather break some brake lines than die. And you can even see there's quite a bit of gap there. Maybe I just can't see it, but I'm not even sure. No. It is on that one jack stand essentially. I mean, it's being held up there, but this is where I saw the best place. You know, you got a steel bracket there connected to the drum. That's the best place I could think of with what I'm going to be taking off on the car. Definitely before I start working on exhaust and shaking that stuff, gonna get the wheels back on the car and probably put those ramps under the wheels. The front is a lot more secure. It's just sitting on, and you got plenty of pinch weld there, so you can put the jack stand there and you have the jack there. That's fairly nice and easy. But this was a bit of a pain to find a place to really put something. Theoretically, you probably could have a jack stand or something under the brake disc here. And I may just put the jacks under there just to keep things safe and keep the car from being damaged. Look at this other side. And you can see that one's hitting right up on there. So the car feels pretty secure. Gave it a good shake. I don't think we're doing anything too crazy. This one's right up against there, so we've got that keeping us safe. When we start working on the rear, maybe that's when I'll throw jacks on there, because otherwise they'll be kind of in the way. So, got the car jacked up. One thing I didn't kind of say the last time. So I put the ramps, as you saw, under the front. I got the front jacked up, and then I put the ramps on it. And I did that largely because I didn't feel comfortable with jacking the front up, putting it on jack stands on those pinch welds, and then jacking the rear up. Now that I've kind of done it, I don't know if that's totally necessary, but I just thought with it moving a bit, I was a little worried about that. So I thought it was safer to put the ramps under there than get the rear up into the air. So that's what he did. I kind of ran out, as you saw in the time lapse, I ran out of room on the one jack, so I had to bring the other one over here to jack it up. So we're pretty high up, which will make it nice for working on. And like I said, I kind of want to be able to start on the exhaust as soon as I can, kind of do it one thing at a time. But something like this, I want to get it off as high of the ground as I can to keep things moving. Interesting update is when I did the dyno run, and if you've watched any of the other podcasts, you will notice that I talked about on the dyno, we noticed a wobble in the rear passenger side. And we weren't sure what was causing it. The wheel was torqued down. Kind of speculated maybe a U-joint or something was going out in the half shaft. But what I was kind of suspecting, but thought it was very unlikely, was that on these an adapter ring like this, so you're matching the hub diameter with the wheel diameter, and that adapter ring has these little clips to hold them in. And I'm not exactly sure really why, because once it's in the wheel, it can't really back out, especially once you get it tightened down. I think it's supposed to be for when you're taking wheels on and off, that hopefully it stays in place. I can tell you right now, these little clips pop out instantaneously. I've had no luck with them. And that actually brings me up to the interesting point, because in fact, what had happened is going to install the wheel, that little clip popped off, and I essentially tightened the wheel against that clip. So that's actually a groove now into the wheel. And this was I didn't have any on the driver's side, the driver's side, but on the front and rear of the passenger side, I have these little grooves now from those rings. And as you can see, there's that hub ring in there. It's in there. I can't even, I can shake it, but I can't really get this one out. I'm sure if I worked at it, I could get it out. But once you have that wheel tight, where is it going to go? I mean, you got a lot of run out on that hub. You're just looking for a little bit of contact just to, make it hub centric. So I'm not even going to use those clips anymore, because at this point, I think they're just a liability. So let's start talking about the front suspension. We obviously guess that's not doing much. Flashlight. All right. So here's our shock, and essentially that coilover I showed you is going to replace that shock entirely. So we've got those bottom bolts and this top bolt. But before we really can even start to work on that, we got to remove the load that is holding those arms up. So what we're going to do is we're going to disconnect the sway bar. To be determined if we're even going to leave the sway bar in. The sway bar can cause a fitment issue. A lot of people end up slotting these mounts and just moving it like a 1/4 inch forward, and that usually gives them enough clearance. So we'll see exactly what we're going to do with that. There's also some kits out there. I may end up having to buy one of those kits. But on the 300, I didn't even run a sway bar, allowing the car to, articulate on each corner on its own. So we may try a similar thing on this and just see how that goes. But we're going to remove the sway bar as well as the spring, at least disconnect the spring. We got to get the shock out of the way before we can take out the spring, I believe. So I'll kind of, sorry. I don't know if you can see the spring. Again, these are those monoleaf composite springs. So that's what we've got to take out to kind of help things drop out. And I don't think we really have to disconnect the front arms or anything like that. I'll be honest with you, this is my first time doing it, and that's why I'm trying to show everything. So anyone who has any questions about it can watch this stuff. But we'll start with kind of taking any load out of the suspension system, and we'll go from there. All right, got the first shock out on the passenger side. That was a pretty easy job to do. The thing I've heard about this is the spring's the hardest, and I won't know how hard that is until I get the other side done. But I wanted to give a quick update since I have the first shock out. Definitely recommend loosening up the sway bar here before you take that shock out, as well as here and down at the bottom right there. You're going to want to loosen that up, and you're going to want to try and get it out right then and there. I'm not exactly sure what happened with mine, but I have a thinking I might not run a sway bar simply because of how hard it was to get this bracket out. As you saw, this is going to be a majority of that time lapse, and my gosh, was this thing, it almost like it's fused essentially to this bearing that rides within the bushing. And I'm assuming it's just rusted in there or something. You saw I used a little torch to even get this thing to kind of move. So it broke away from the bushing that it was in. So that bushing's ruined. So I had to get a new bushing and new bracket or figure something else out. And that something else might just be a sway bar. So I'm going to start on the other side, but I guess I'll give you a quick recap here before I go back over there. You've got 5 little screws along there, and you got 2 that connect to this, is that AC line or coolant? That's a coolant line. I think that's a coolant line. Might be AC, whatever it is. So you got 7 screws you take out. That removes that plastic protection piece just to give you a little bit more room to work with. Not a bad idea to put a jack underneath the arm. I did not do that. but the bolts actually caught on the aluminum arm. Thankfully I was able to just kind of screw them out essentially. You know, if you want to avoid damaging that arm, I'd recommend putting a jack under there just to hold it up in its place once the shock is removed. So you're going to take those bolts out. Like I said already with the sway bar, I'd try and do that stuff first. If for some reason, like me, you have an issue with that bottom one, you're gonna have to pull the shock to get to work at it. So let's move to the next side. All right, so taking off the driver's side this time. Again, definitely recommend putting a jack under the wheel. Made it a lot easier to get the shock out, or you know, didn't have any interference with the bolts in the lower arm. Still had an issue with the sway bar, but loosening up did help with the top and just making that a little bit easier to get out for that top mount, which mounts to here. And then this mounts into the arm, and as you can see, just like the other one, I basically had to bend to get it out because that collar bushing for the sway bar had it's just solid in place. You saw on the other one I tried heating it up. This one I didn't even bother trying to heat it up and spin it. It just tore away right from the bushing. So I'll have to do something about that, either get new parts or just not run a sway bar, which I've already been considering just because I'm not a huge fan of, well, I shouldn't say I'm not a huge fan of, but I think it's sometimes more advantageous to have the suspension completely independent from one another. So that'll kind of depend more on the testing that we find with the coilovers and what we think. But to begin with, I may just run it out without sway bars. The coilovers will fit without them. And then I don't really have to wait for anything. So we'll see what I kind of decide there. But now let's move to the spring, which is supposed to be the hardest part, is getting that spring out. All right, so we're under the Corvette, under the front end of it. And the reason I'm showing you under here is because we got to remove some bolts to get these shocks out. And to remove those bolts, you can see you got a bracket there and a bracket there. And I believe that's all we have to take out. I'm looking at these little plates here. I'm not sure if they do anything else. Some of the videos I've seen, I haven't seen anyone remove these plates. I could see that making it a lot easier to get the spring out, but we'll start with these 4 bolts and we'll go from there. So I'll get the camera set up and we'll get going. All right, so quick update. One thing I forgot to mention, or didn't mention when I was talking about pulling this spring out, is you have to get the lower control arm out of the way. So some people will take the lower ball joint out and push the lower arm out of that way, which then you kind of have to push the upper control arm and hub out of the way. What I'm going to try... that probably won't work. I was going to try work if I take the tie rod off. Maybe I will still try it. Essentially, I was going to unhook the caliper. I'd have to unhook the toe arm. And then I was going to take these 2 bolts out on the top for the upper control arm and swing the whole thing down and out of the way. And I still think that's going to be the best given how I've got this set up. I don't have it on a lift or anything like that where I can push up on this one side and pull it down. I think it'll help get it out of the way, make it a little bit easier to get that spring out. One of the issues I am having is these lower mounts that you guys saw in the first part of this for the spring removal. On the passenger side, I was able to get the mount and the bolts out, no problem. You're able to push the bolts out and grab them, no issue. On the driver's side, the bracket came out, but the bolts are still in there. There's stuff on that side of the C4 that is kind of hitting, and it's making it difficult to get out. So I'm going to see if I can pull it out, because it seems like there's maybe enough room to pull the spring out without those bolts, or at least be able to move the spring, so then I can actually get to those bolts and pull them out. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start again trying to take this tie rod off, and going from there. I'm going to have to realign this whole thing anyways, with coilovers going on, so really isn't too big of a deal. Alright, so here's what I found from experimenting on the other side. You can't just take these bolts out and swing it over. Not sure why I thought that, but you obviously have this ball joint there. I was expecting that to be a little bit more flexible than it was, obviously. So what you need to do, for sure, I did end up removing the upper control arm on the other side. What I'm going to do on this side, and I'll put the camera up so you guys can see it, but I wanted to just do a run through on that side, or on the driver's side, so I could see kind of how this plane was going to work. But essentially what you're going to do is, like I said, you're going to take this toe arm nut off, get that out of the way. You're going to take the brake caliper off. You'll need something to kind of hold it in place. And you can see here, you also have a wheel speed sensor. You got a wire going to that. You're going to want to unclip that wire and get it out of the way, so that way this hub can essentially fully swing down. But I found that to be a little bit easier to do than dealing with the lower ball joint and then still having to try and move the hub and the upper arm out of the way. This basically just swings all the way down. In fact, the spring moved a little bit when I did it on the other side. So I'm going to try it over here, and hopefully we can get the spring out. But I definitely see why people say this is the hardest bit, because there's just no budge in it, and you're dealing with the spring, so it's loaded all the time pretty much. And basically you're trying to take off all the load, and it's not exactly an easy thing to do. So without further ado, I'll get the camera set up and start working on this side. All right, well, I got the spring out, and I get why people say it's the hardest thing, and also why having a lift would make it quite a bit easier. Leaving the the upper control arm on and just separating it there instead of the lower control arm worked great. Actually made a lot of room, freed up the spring right away to get it moving, and actually first couple inches of movement was pretty easy, but what you end up having is, oh shit, where did I put the spring now? I put it over there. You've got these rubber mounts halfway to center or whatever, and then you got these little outer rubber mounts. And whichever side you're pushing from, or whether opposite of the side you're pulling from, those little rubber mounts on the very end get caught on every one of those gaps and right on that first edge. And so essentially what you have to do is you kind of got to hammer it up and over. And this is why I say having a lift would help, because that first one, once you kind of get it up and over, the spring is trying to drop out, but it can't like this because it's contacting the floor. So you kind of got to do a push and pull kind of thing. But once you get through that first slip, it moves quite a bit, and then it kind of gets caught up on that second one. But enough where you still have enough room to where you can hammer it, kind of hammer it on that second gap, and then it pops loose for the most part, and then you're able to pull it out. But yeah, Front is all done. I'm going to throw the upper control arm on. And then I guess that's it for this part 1 video of the front suspension teardown to get coilovers in. You're going to want to put everything back together. I guess I should throw a little bit of that on, but if you took it apart, you should know how to throw it back together. So I'll throw it back together here quick. And I'm going to start on part 2, which is the teardown of the rear suspension, which is supposed to be way easier. So I'm really looking forward to it. But until next time, keep the shiny side up, and I'll catch you for part 2.